The morning light of early May 1873 filtered through the grimy windows of a Brussels workshop, catching motes of ancient textile dust that danced like memories in the air. Our restorer, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any master of this dying craft, sat hunched over a fragment of 15th century verdure, his practiced fingers reading the wool's testimony like a blind man reads scripture. At 42 years, his hands had developed that particular steadiness that comes not from youth, but from decades of coaxing broken threads back to wholeness. The calluses on his fingertips had their own geography, mapped by countless hours of patient work. Strange how a man's body becomes shaped by his trade, he often mused. Weavers develop a forward lean, smiths a rightward strength, and restorers, well, they develop the ability to see time itself in the twist of a fiber. The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow house near the Sablon, that quarter where artisans had plied their trades since the Dukes of Burgundy held court. But the Brussels of 1873 bore little resemblance to that golden age of tapestry. The mechanical looms of Manchester and Lyon had done what no war could accomplish. They had made the patient art of the haute lisse obsolete. Progress, his late wife had called it, though her tone suggested she found the word bitter as chicory. 3 years now since consumption had taken her. The workshop still held her presence in small ways. The porcelain cup she'd brought him coffee in each morning, the cushion she'd embroidered for his work chair, the faint scent of the lavender she'd hung to keep moths at bay. He'd grown used to the silence, or told himself he had. Work helped. There was always work, even if it came slower now, even if the great manufacturers preferred to simply replace rather than restore. The letter arrived as he was preparing a Morton solution, the postman's knock breaking his concentration. The paper was thick, expensive, watermarked with a coat of arms he recognized, the Van Hecht family of Ghent. His finger traced the wax seal, feeling the deep impression of the signet ring. Old money, old power, the kind that survived revolutions by bending just enough to avoid breaking. Baron Leopold van Hecht wrote in the formal French still preferred by Flemish nobility, though the restorer noticed small tells that suggested the Baron thought in Flemish. The word order occasionally twisted, the preference for certain constructions. The commission seemed straightforward: restoration and cleaning of a major family tapestry dated to the late 16th century. The fee mentioned was generous, surprisingly so, but it was the postscript that made him pause. The work must be completed in situ. The tapestry cannot be moved. He set down the letter and returned to his mordant, adding oak gall drop by drop to the iron solution. His apprentice would have measured it precisely, following the manual's instructions to the letter. But young Jacob had left 2 months ago, lured by the steady wages of the textile factories in Verviers. "I'm sorry, master," the boy had said, "but I need to eat every day, not just when rich folks remember their old wall hangings need tending." The restorer couldn't blame him. This was the age of the railroad and the telegraph, of scientific agriculture and industrial progress. What place was there for a man who spent weeks repairing a single moth hole in a tapestry that depicted myths no one remembered? Yet, someone had to tend to these remnants of beauty. Someone had to remember how the old masters had achieved that particular shade of blue using woad and indigo, how they'd made thread from silk and gold that could last 500 years. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. The workshop would manage without him for a few months. There were no urgent commissions waiting. His neighbor, Madame Verstraeten, would water the plants his wife had loved. The Baron's letter suggested accommodations would be provided at the estate. It would be good to escape Brussels for a while, to work in the countryside where the air didn't taste of coal smoke and progress. He began preparing his traveling restoration kit, the special needles inherited from his master, the magnifying glasses graduated in strength, the samples of thread he'd collected over 20 years, organized by date and provenance. Each tool had its purpose, its perfect application. His wife had once laughed at his fastidiousness. "You pack your needles like a surgeon prepares for an operation," she'd said. But wasn't that what restoration was? Surgery on the body of the past, attempting to heal wounds inflicted by time and neglect. The last item he packed was a notebook, its pages half filled with observations on technique, sketches of unusual weaving patterns, formulas for cleaning solutions. On a blank page, he wrote, "Commission Van Hecht, May 1873. Below it, from habit, he began to sketch the coat of arms from the seal. 3 water birds, herons perhaps, above a chevron. Old heraldry, speaking of moorland and patient hunting. He wondered what story this tapestry would tell, what secrets 5 centuries of thread might reveal. The train journey from Brussels to Ghent took less than an hour, another miracle of the modern age that made the restorer slightly uneasy. His grandfather would have spent half a day making this trip by canal boat, time enough to prepare one's mind for arrival. Now the countryside flashed past in a blur of early summer green, and before he'd properly settled his thoughts, the conductor was announcing their arrival. Baron Van Hecht had sent a carriage, driven by a taciturn Fleming who smelled of pipe tobacco and horse liniment. The estate lay some miles outside Ghent proper, in that fertile land between the Scheldt and the Leie, where the soil had been enriched by centuries of flooding. As they rolled through the countryside, the restorer observed the careful geometry of the fields, wheat already showing gold at the tips, flax in blue flower, plots of turnips and potatoes. This was cultivation as art form, every hedge and ditch placed with purpose. The house itself appeared gradually, first its crow-stepped gables rising above a line of ancient linden trees, then its full bulk of mellowed brick and limestone. Not a castle, precisely, but something more defendable than a mere manor, the kind of compromise the Spanish occupation had necessitated, when nobility needed to show wealth without appearing too fortress-like. The restorer counted windows automatically, a habit from calculating the light available for work. 32 on the facade alone. Baron Leopold Van Hecht received him in what was clearly the estate's ceremonial hall, a room designed to impress without quite intimidating. The Baron was 58 years of silver dignity, his mustaches waxed to points that belonged more to his father's generation. "You come highly recommended," he said in French, though his accent revealed Ghent roots. "The Arenberg restoration particularly impressed us." Behind the Baron stood a younger man, perhaps 35, whose modern collar and practical boots marked him as something other than aristocracy. "My estate manager, Hendrik Maas," the Baron explained. "He handles the tiresome details that keep this old pile functioning." Maas offered a firm handshake and a measured smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The restorer recognized the type, ambitious men who'd learned their Latin and accounting, who understood that the future belonged to those who could bridge the gap between the old order and the new. "Now then," the Baron said, his tone shifting to something almost reverent. "You must meet our ancestor." The tapestry hung in what had once been the estate's great hall, a room 2 stories high with clear-story windows that filled the space with northern light. The restorer's first glimpse stopped him mid-stride. He'd seen grander tapestries, certainly, the Apocalypse series in Angers, the Acts of the Apostles in the Vatican. But this piece had a presence, a weight of accumulated time that pressed against the observer. It measured perhaps 20 feet by 15, woven in the mille fleurs style popular in the late 1500s, though with a sophistication that suggested Brussels or Oudenarde workshops. The background teemed with flora and fauna, rabbits, peacocks, hunting dogs frozen mid-leap among impossible roses and authentic-looking oaks. But the eye was drawn inevitably to the central figure, a man in the black doublet and white ruff of Philip II's era. Seated beneath a stylized tree, his face turned 3/4 toward the viewer. "Joris von Hecht," the Baron announced, "my ancestor 13 generations removed. He lost 3 sons in the wars, 1 at Newport, 2 to the Spanish fever during the siege of Ostend. They say he never smiled again." The restorer moved closer, his practiced eye cataloging damage even as he absorbed the artistry. Dust certainly accumulated in the depths of the weave, some fading in the blues and greens where light had struck for centuries. Minor repairs, crudely done, probably 18th century. But the face was extraordinary. The unknown weaver had achieved something remarkable in those features, a mobility of expression that seemed to shift with the angle of observation. "There's more," Hendrik Mays said, his voice carrying an odd note the restorer couldn't quite place. "Tell him about the prophecy, my lord." The Baron's expression grew solemn. "For 300 years, the family has observed that Joris's expression changes. When drought threatens, his sorrow deepens. Before the rains come, something in his countenance lightens." He paused, perhaps expecting skepticism. "I know how it sounds to modern ears, but I've seen it myself many times. My father saw it, his father before him." The restorer kept his expression professionally neutral. He'd encountered such legends before, paintings whose eyes followed observers, statues that wept before disasters. Usually there were explanations involving angles of light, accumulations of moisture, tricks of perception. "May I examine it more closely?" he asked. "Of course. That's why you're here." The Baron gestured toward the tapestry. "Though I must ask, you'll work here, in this room? We cannot risk moving it. The last time someone tried, in my grandfather's day..." He trailed off, shaking his head. As the restorer approached the tapestry, a young woman entered the hall carrying a tea service. Perhaps 28, with the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested she read more than just household accounts. "My niece, Marie-Claude," the Baron said. "She manages the household since my wife passed." Marie set down the tray with practiced grace, but the restorer noticed how her gaze lingered on the tapestry, analytical rather than reverent. "You must think us terribly superstitious," she said in French, smoother than her uncle's. "I think," the restorer replied carefully, "that textiles of this age often surprise us with their complexity." He turned back to the tapestry, running his fingers along its surface without quite touching, feeling the subtle variations in temperature where different materials had been used. Something about the face nagged at him, a technical inconsistency he couldn't quite identify. The old chapel had been consecrated in 1492, according to the date carved above its door, though it hadn't seen regular services for decades. The Baron had ordered it cleared for the restorer's workshop, and by late May's warm afternoons, it had become a sanctuary of a different sort. Light streamed through the remaining stained glass. Most panels had been sold off during some previous financial crisis, casting pools of amber and vermilion across the stone floor. The restorer had spent 3 days establishing his workspace, with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing an operating theater. Tables at the proper height, tools arranged by frequency of use, chemical solutions in labeled bottles standing like an apothecary's arsenal. The tapestry itself had been carefully lowered from the Great Hall's wall by a team of estate workers, their nervousness palpable as they handled their master's prophetic heirloom. Now, spread across specially prepared boards, Joris von Hecht's sorrowful face gazed at the chapel's vaulted ceiling, while the restorer began his intimate examination. Each morning he started with the same ritual, a full visual survey, noting changes in the light, any shifts in the textile's tension. Then came the close work with magnifying glass and probe, mapping every thread's path through the warp and weft of centuries. It was during one such examination that Marie Claes arrived, carrying a tray with bottles of distilled water and pure alcohol he'd requested from Ghent. She moved with a quiet efficiency he'd noticed before, but today she lingered, watching him work. "My uncle says you trained in Brussels," she ventured, setting down the supplies. "Under Master Vandenberg," he confirmed, not lifting his eye from the glass. "Dead now these 15 years. "I studied chemistry in Leuven," she said, and something in her tone made him look up. "Not officially, of course. They don't grant degrees to women. But Professor Stas allowed me to attend lectures if I sat behind a screen." The restorer studied her for a moment. Jean Servais Stas. He knew the name, the pioneering chemist who determined atomic weights with unprecedented accuracy. "Then perhaps you could help me prepare a specific solution," he said. "I need to test the mordants used in these dyes without damaging the fibers." Her face lit with an enthusiasm that transformed her from household manager to natural philosopher. As they worked together, mixing precise proportions of ammonia and distilled water, she revealed more of her story. Her father, the Baron's younger brother, had encouraged her education until his death 5 years ago. Since then, she'd become indispensable to her uncle's household, though the restorer sensed this wasn't the life she'd imagined. "Look at this," he said suddenly, directing her attention to a section of the tapestry near Joris's left cheek. Under magnification, the normal pattern of silk and wool threads was interrupted by something else, fibers with a different texture, a different response to light. Marie leaned close, her breathing careful not to disturb the textile. "They're not plant-based," she observed. "The structure is wrong." "Animal fiber, but not wool or silk." The restorer's probe had isolated a single thread, slightly yellowed with age, but still remarkably supple. "Feel the tension," he instructed, guiding her finger to barely touch the surrounding area. The mysterious threads were tighter than their neighbors, creating an almost imperceptible pull in the fabric. A knock at the chapel door interrupted their investigation. Anna, the kitchen maid, entered with the midday meal, bread, cheese, and the thin beer that served as everyday drink in Flanders. She was perhaps 24, with the kind of observant eyes that suggested intelligence trapped by circumstance. "Begging your pardon," she said in Flemish accented French, "but Mynheer Mays asks if you'll dine in the hall or here." "Here, thank you." the restorer replied, noting how Anna's gaze fixed on the tapestry with something approaching fear. After the maid left, Marie explained, "The servants believe absolutely in the prophecy. Anna's father is a tenant farmer. They plan their entire year around what Joris's face supposedly reveals." That afternoon, the restorer made a disturbing discovery. Using a solution that reacted differently to various proteins, he identified the mysterious fibers conclusively. They were sinew, probably deer or cattle, specially prepared to maintain flexibility. He'd seen such threads before in medieval medical texts that described their use for surgical sutures. But in a tapestry? The pattern of their placement was deliberate, concentrated around the eyes and mouth of the sorrowful ancestor, woven through the regular threads like nerves through muscle. Someone had designed this, planned it with extraordinary skill. But why? Father Antonius arrived as the afternoon sun slanted low through the western windows. At 65, the priest moved with the careful dignity of a man preserving his energy for essential tasks. "The Baron mentioned you might appreciate historical context," he said, producing a leather journal from his cassock. "I've kept weather records for 40 years, as did my predecessor." The restorer accepted the journal with interest. Priests often served as unofficial chroniclers, recording not just baptisms and deaths, but harvests, floods, unusual events. "Has the tapestry's behavior been consistent?" he asked carefully. The old priest's eyes held a complexity of knowledge and discretion. "Remarkably so. Though I've noticed the predictions have become more accurate in recent decades, since perhaps 1850 or so." He paused meaningfully. "Around the time young Hendrik Mays came to manage the estate." As evening approached, the restorer worked alone, testing the response of the sinew threads to various stimuli. Heat made them contract slightly, cold, less effect, but moisture was the key. Even the ambient humidity change between morning and evening created measurable tension variations. In the failing light, he could almost see it happening. The face of Joris van Hecht, shifting by degrees, invisible to casual observation, but profound in accumulation. Early June brought a peculiar warmth to Flanders, the kind that made the old women in the village mutter about unnatural seasons and consult their joints for weather predictions. The restorer had been at the estate for 3 weeks now, long enough to establish routines, to become part of the household's daily rhythm rather than a notable guest. His workspace in the chapel had evolved into something between laboratory and monk's cell. He'd mapped every inch of the tapestry, creating detailed drawings that showed not just the image, but the underlying structure, the grammar of its construction, as his old master would have said. Each type of thread had its own notation, each weaving technique its particular symbol. The sinew threads he marked in red ink, their pattern emerging like veins beneath skin. The morning's work required particular concentration. He was documenting the exact placement of these unusual fibers, noting how they'd been integrated into the original weave with remarkable skill. Whoever had done this understood not just tapestry making, but anatomy, engineering, the behavior of materials under stress. It was genius of a disturbing sort. Marie arrived earlier than usual, carrying a barometer she'd borrowed from her uncle's study. "I thought this might interest you," she said, setting the instrument on his work table. The glass tube, with its mercury column, had been made in Paris, according to the engraved brass plate. I've been recording the readings each day, comparing them to the estate's harvest records. She produced a notebook filled with neat columns of figures, graphs plotted with scientific precision. The restorer recognized a kindred spirit in method, if not medium.
Look here, she pointed to a correlation she'd discovered. Every time the barometric pressure drops significantly, within 2 days my uncle announces that Joris predicts rain. Your uncle checks the barometer? No, never. He considers such instruments newfangled nonsense. Marie's expression suggested long familiarity with her uncle's contradictions. But Hendrik Mies keeps one in his office. I've seen him consulting it frequently. The restorer returned to his examination of the tapestry, but his mind was working through implications. If Mies was using atmospheric pressure to predict weather changes, and if the sinew threads responded to humidity changes that preceded rain, he paused, probe in hand. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. As humidity rose before a storm, the sinew threads would absorb moisture from the air, swelling slightly, changing the tension across Joris's face. The effect would be subtle but cumulative.
"May I?" Marie asked, gesturing toward his magnifying glass. He handed it to her, watching as she studied the area around the figure's mouth. "These threads," she said slowly, "they're not original to the 1600s, are they?" "What makes you think that?" "The dye. It's similar but not identical. And the way they're integrated, it's skillful, but the technique is different. More systematic, less intuitive than the original weaver's work." The restorer felt a flash of admiration. She'd seen what had taken him days to recognize. "When would you date them?" "Difficult to say precisely, but," she straightened, thinking, "Father Antonius mentioned the predictions becoming more accurate around 1850. That's also when my uncle's father had the tapestry cleaned and restored." A heavy footfall in the chapel doorway announced Hendrik Mies. The estate manager entered with his usual air of barely contained energy, his eyes quickly scanning the scene. The barometer, the notebooks, the two of them in close consultation. "I hope the work progresses well," he said in his careful French. "The Baron is anxious about the summer harvest decisions." "The restoration cannot be rushed," the restorer replied evenly. "Your tapestry has many complexities." Mies moved closer, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The restorer noticed how his gaze went immediately to the face of Joris, studying it with an intensity that seemed more calculating than reverent. "The Baron puts great stock in the family traditions," Mies said. "The tenants, too. Their faith in the tapestry's prophecies has guided agricultural decisions for generations." "And these decisions," Marie asked with apparent innocence, "they've been successful?" "Remarkably so. The estate has prospered, while others have struggled." Mies's pride was evident. "We've avoided the worst of the poor harvests, sold grain when prices peaked, bought when they fell. The Baron attributes it to following the ancestors' guidance." The restorer continued his work, letting silence fill the chapel. He'd learned long ago that silence made most people uncomfortable, made them talk to fill the void. Mies was no exception. "Of course," the manager continued, "one must know how to interpret the signs correctly. The changes in expression can be subtle. It takes years of observation to read them properly." He paused by the window, gazing out at the fields. "My predecessor kept extensive notes. I've continued his work, documenting each prediction and its outcome." "A scientific approach to the supernatural," Marie observed, her tone perfectly balanced between interest and skepticism. Mies turned, and for a moment his mask of professional courtesy slipped.
The restorer saw something else. Intelligence, certainly, but also a kind of desperate pride. Here was a man who'd risen from nothing through ability alone, who'd made himself indispensable to aristocrats, who would never fully accept him as an equal. "Science and tradition need not be enemies," Mays said finally. "Sometimes the old ways encode wisdom we don't fully understand. My duty is to serve the estate's interests, whether through modern agricultural techniques or ancient prophecies." After he left, the restorer and Marie worked in thoughtful silence. The June sun climbed toward noon, heating the chapel stones, raising the humidity perceptibly. And there, yes, there, the restorer could see it happening. The faintest shift in the tapestry's surface, a microscopic alteration in tension that changed how shadows fell across Joris van Hecht's sorrowful features. The Baron's announcement came with the formality of a royal decree. He stood in the great hall that mid-June morning, his silver whiskers trembling with the importance of his words. The household had assembled quickly, servants abandoning their morning tasks, tenant farmers called in from the fields, even the restorer summoned from his patient work in the chapel. "The ancestor has spoken," Baron von Hecht intoned, his voice echoing off the space where the tapestry normally hung. "I have studied the signs carefully. Drought will come. We must prepare accordingly." The restorer observed the varied reactions rippling through the crowd. Some of the older servants crossed themselves, accepting this pronouncement as they would accept scripture. Others, particularly among the younger farmers, showed skepticism barely masked by deference. Anna stood near the kitchen door, her knuckles white as she gripped her apron. Her father, a weathered man of perhaps 50, had removed his cap and clutched it like a talisman. Hendrik Mays stepped forward, ledger in hand, transforming mystic prophecy into practical action. "The estate will begin purchasing grain reserves tomorrow. I advise all tenants to hold whatever surplus you possess. Prices will rise." Already the restorer could see the economic machinery beginning to turn. Two farmers near the door whispered urgently about their stored wheat. A widow who sold eggs was calculating whether to trade them for flour now or wait. The prophecy hadn't created drought, that remained to be seen. But it had certainly created immediate financial consequence. After the assembly dispersed, the restorer ventured into the village, claiming need for specific solvents. The market square buzzed with unusual energy for a Thursday. Word of the Baron's pronouncement had spread like fire through thatch. At every stall, negotiations had taken on a desperate edge. "Madness," Willem Johnsons was declaring to anyone within earshot. The grain merchant stood beside his wagon, face flushed with indignation. "3 farms have already withdrawn their promised sales." "My contracts mean nothing when that old fool sees visions in his moldy carpet." A young farmer defended the tradition. "The tapestry's never been wrong. My grandfather remembered the predictions, saving the harvest of 1823. "Your grandfather remembered what he wanted to remember," Chansons shot back. "And Hendrik Maas knows exactly what he's doing. Watch who profits from these prophecies. It's always the estate, buying low, selling high." The restorer purchased his supplies while absorbing the market's mood. Within hours, the Baron's words had shifted the entire local economy. Grain prices had jumped 10%. Those who needed to buy grew desperate. Those who had stock to sell grew cautious.
The prophecy was reshaping reality through pure belief. Returning to the estate, he found Marie in her uncle's study, surrounded by agricultural records spanning decades. She'd appropriated the Baron's own barometer and was comparing its readings to a chart she'd constructed.
"Look at this pattern," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Every major prediction aligns with significant barometric shifts, but announced days before the weather actually changes." The restorer studied her data. The correlation was undeniable. "Someone understands atmospheric science," he said carefully. "Hendrik," her voice carried certainty. "He has 3 barometers in his office, I've seen them. French, English, and a new German model. He records readings twice daily." Through the window, they watched carts arriving at the estate's granaries, loaded with grain purchased at panic prices. If drought did materialize, and falling atmospheric pressure suggested it might, these reserves would double in value within months. The estate would profit enormously from its divine foresight. A tentative knock interrupted them. Anna entered, her usual composure cracked.
"Miss Marie, might I speak freely?"
"Always, Anna." The young woman's story spilled out. Her father's debts, the poor harvest last year, money borrowed against future crops to pay for her brother's education. If drought comes and we lose the harvest, the moneylender will take everything. 20 years my father has worked this land. Marie's expression softened. "How much would prevent disaster?" 40 guilders would clear the debt, miss. But we couldn't possibly. The estate sometimes provides advances against future rent, Marie interrupted, glancing at the restorer. "Given your family's long service, I'm certain my uncle would approve. Speak with Hendrik tomorrow." After Anna departed, overwhelmed with gratitude, Marie slumped in her chair. "One family saved, but how many others suffer? This morning I saw old Vermeer selling his plow horse. The butcher was measuring it for meat price." The restorer considered the delicate social fabric being pulled apart by fear and greed. In his Brussels workshop, poverty was predictable, manageable. Here, entire families balanced on the edge of ruin, dependent on the whims of weather and the interpretations of an ancient tapestry. That evening, unable to rest, he returned to the chapel. The tapestry lay vulnerable in candlelight, Joris van Hecht's sorrowful face seeming to watch him work. The sinew threads had definitely tightened since morning. The humidity was dropping, suggesting high pressure building. Fair weather coming, perhaps for weeks. The drought prophecy might prove accurate after all. But accuracy born of science, disguised as superstition. What moral weight did that carry? The restorer touched the ancient fibers gently, feeling the accumulated choices of centuries in their twist and tension. Tomorrow he would continue his restoration, but tonight he wondered whether some things should remain hidden, whether truth always served justice. Late June had settled over Flanders like a heavy blanket, confirming the Baron's drought prediction with each rainless day. The restorer worked through the heat in his chapel sanctuary, his shirt damp with perspiration, despite the stone's coolness. The sinew threads in the tapestry had contracted to their tightest point, pulling Joris van Hecht's features into an expression of profound grief that even he, knowing the mechanism, found unsettling. His documentation was nearly complete. Pages of detailed drawings showing exactly how the sinew threads created their effect, chemical analyses of their composition, observations of their response to varying humidity levels. Any competent scientist could replicate his findings. The question that kept him awake was whether any competent scientist should. Marie arrived with his afternoon refreshment, but also with news. Willem Janssens' son has fallen ill. The fever that comes from bad water.
Their well has gone nearly dry.
The restorer set down his probe. Across the estate, he'd noticed the effects of 3 weeks without rain. Withering kitchen gardens, anxious faces at the depleted stream. The Baron's prophecy was fulfilling itself in the cruelest way possible. "There's something else," Marie continued, producing a leather journal from her basket. "I found this in the library's restricted section. The restoration records from 1851. The journal bore the signature of François Delacroix, not the painter, but a master restorer from Bruges. The restorer recognized the name. The man had been legendary for his technical innovation. The entries were detailed, professional, until one dated August 7th. The Baron requires modifications to the family tapestry. I have expressed my reservations, but the fee offered would support my workshop for 2 years.
God forgive me. I proceed.
The subsequent pages describe the installation of the sinew threads with scientific precision. Delacroix had understood exactly what he was creating. A humidity-responsive mechanism that would give the tapestry's central figure an illusion of prophetic expression. The final entry was brief. "The work is complete. The Baron is pleased. I leave tomorrow and shall not return." "My uncle's father," Marie said quietly. "He commissioned this deception." The restorer studied the journal, noting Delacroix's technical brilliance, even as he recognized the moral anguish in the increasingly cramped handwriting. Here was a master craftsman who had prostituted his skill for gold, who had created a beautiful lie that would manipulate generations. Heavy footsteps announced Hendrik Maas before he appeared in the chapel doorway. The estate manager looked haggard, managing a crisis. Even an anticipated one was taking its toll. His usual careful appearance showed signs of strain. Dust on his boots, ink stains on his fingers. "The Baron wishes to know when the tapestry will be restored," he said, though his eyes suggested this wasn't his only purpose. "Soon," the restorer replied, "though I've discovered some complications." Maes moved closer, his gaze sharp. "What manner of complications?" The restorer held the man's stare. "The kind that raise questions about the nature of restoration. Should one preserve a later modification that has become integral to the work's significance?" The air in the chapel grew dense with unspoken understanding. Maes glanced at the journal in Marie's hands, recognizing it perhaps. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "You know." It wasn't a question. The restorer nodded slowly. Maes walked to the window, gazing out at the parched fields. 20 years I've managed this estate. When I arrived, it was failing. Medieval agricultural practices, no understanding of crop rotation. The Baron spending more than the land produced. He turned back to face them. "Now we're the most prosperous estate in the region. The tenants have food, shelter, stability. Is that not worth preserving?" "Built on deception," Marie said, though her tone carried more sadness than accusation. "Built on giving people what they need," Maes countered. "The Baron needs to believe in his family's special providence. The tenants need to believe someone can read the future, protect them from uncertainty. I provide that belief, backed by science they wouldn't understand or accept. The restorer thought of Anna's father, saved from ruin by an advance from the estate, of the grain reserves that would see the community through drought purchased with profits from previous prophecies. The moral calculation wasn't simple. "The previous restorer knew," the restorer said, not quite a question. Mays nodded. Delacroix left detailed instructions for maintaining the mechanism. Every 20 years or so, someone must adjust the sinew threads, ensure they respond properly. You're the first to discover it independently. And if I refuse to maintain this fiction, then I'll find another restorer who will. Or the tapestry will deteriorate, lose its prophetic power, and the entire economy of this region will collapse into chaos. Mize's voice carried no threat, only weary pragmatism. The tenants have built their lives around these predictions. Take that away suddenly, and how many families suffer? The restorer returned to his work, fingers moving automatically through familiar motions while his mind grappled with unfamiliar ethical territory. He'd spent his life pursuing truth through thread and fiber, uncovering what time had hidden. Now he was being asked to perpetuate a lie that had become more real than truth. That evening, he walked alone through the village. The drought had left its mark everywhere. Wilting crops, empty water troughs, children kept indoors to avoid the heat. But there was order, too, a sense of community preparing for known hardship. The Baron's prophecy had allowed them to prepare, to ration, to support one another. Would knowing the truth serve them better? The first week of July brought a change in the air that only the most sensitive instruments could detect. The restorer noticed it in the chapel's atmosphere, a subtle shift in how the stone felt against his palm, a different quality to the morning light. Hendrik Mays noticed it in his 3 barometers, their mercury columns beginning their slow climb from the depths they'd occupied for weeks. The Baron summoned his household again on July 7th, a Sunday, after morning mass. Father Antonius had preached about Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, 7 years of plenty and 7 of famine. The parallel was lost on no one. Now the Baron stood before his tapestry's absence, his bearing that of Moses descending with tablets. "The ancestor's expression has begun to change," he announced. "The sorrow lifts slightly. Rain will come within the fortnight. We shall begin selling our grain reserves at tomorrow's market." The restorer watched the crowd's reaction, relief mixed with calculation. Those who had held grain through the drought would profit. Those who had sold in panic weeks ago wore expressions of bitter regret. Willem Janssens, who had somehow been convinced to attend, stood near the door, his face a study in controlled fury. In the chapel afterward, the restorer examined the tapestry with Marie and, surprisingly, Father Antonius. The priest had asked to observe the restoration, claiming historical interest. Now he studied the sinew threads through the restorer's magnifying glass with the intensity of a theologian parsing scripture. "Remarkable," the priest murmured. "The mechanism is so elegant." "Like the clockwork of the cosmos itself," Marie started. "You know?" Father Antonius straightened, his old eyes twinkling. "I've known for 20 years, since I found Delacroix's confession in the church records. He sought absolution before leaving. I gave it, of course. Who am I to judge the compromises men make to feed their families?" The restorer felt the ground of certainty shifting beneath him. "And you've kept this secret? What would you have me do? Destroy the faith that sustains this community? Tell Anna's father that the predictions he's built his life around are mere atmospheric pressure translated through preserved sinew? The priest shook his head. Truth isn't always kind. Sometimes mercy requires selective blindness. That afternoon brought vindication of the Baron's prophecy in the form of clouds gathering on the western horizon. The restorer worked steadily, cleaning centuries of dust from the tapestry's surface, while Marie assisted with the chemical preparations.
They had developed an easy rhythm, their hands knowing when to move, when to pause, like dancers, sharing familiar music. "I've decided something," Marie said suddenly. "After this is over, I'm going to Paris. The Sorbonne has begun accepting women as auditors in the natural sciences. I have enough saved." The restorer paused in his work. He had grown accustomed to her presence, her quick intelligence, the way she saw through surface to structure. "Your uncle will object." "My uncle will adapt. He always has." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps I'll study meteorology. Learn to predict weather through science rather than sinew." Hendrik Mies arrived as the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm against the chapel's windows. His satisfaction was evident. The estate's granaries were already half empty, their contents sold at premium prices to desperate buyers who'd waited too long. "The Baron is pleased," he told the restorer. "The ancestors' prophecy has proven true once again." He paused, studying the tapestry. "How much longer for the restoration?" "A week, perhaps 2. The cleaning is nearly complete. The structural repairs are minor." Mies nodded, then did something unexpected. He sat down on one of the chapel's ancient pews, suddenly looking every one of his 35 years. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" he asked, apropos of nothing. "Watching Willem Johnson's boy suffer from fever, while his father refuses charity from the estate. Pride and suspicion keeping him from help his son needs." "You could tell him the truth," Marie suggested gently. "The truth?" Mies laughed bitterly. "That I've been manipulating market prices for years using hidden barometers and ancient animal sinew? He'd have me arrested for fraud, and he'd be right." He stood, composing himself. "No, we maintain the fiction because the fiction has become the foundation." Pull one thread, and everything unravels. That evening, as rain drummed steadily on the chapel roof, the restorer worked alone. The tapestry was nearly clean now, Joris van Hecht's features restored to their full expressive power. In the lamplight, with shadows shifting across the textile surface, he could almost see the face changing. Moisture in the air, causing the sinew threads to swell, relaxing the tension, softening the grief-stricken expression into something approaching peace. He thought about his late wife, how she'd always said that restoration was an act of faith. Faith that the past deserved preservation, that beauty justified effort, that truth would eventually emerge through patient work. But what happened when the truth one uncovered was itself a lie? What happened when the lie had become more truthful than fact? The rain continued through the night, soaking into the parched earth, filling wells and cisterns, bringing relief that was real, regardless of how it had been predicted. The restorer worked on, his stitches small and precise, each one a choice to preserve not just thread and image, but the complex web of belief and deception that sustained an entire community. Mid-July brought the kind of steady rain that farmers call a blessing and townspeople call tedious. The restorer had moved his primary work back to the Great Hall, where the tapestry would soon hang again. The piece was nearly complete, cleaned, stabilized, its colors restored to something approaching their original brilliance. Only the final decision remained: what to do about the sinew threads. He found Hendrik Mays in his office, a room that revealed more about the man than any conversation could. 3 barometers on one wall, their readings meticulously logged in a ledger. Agricultural treatises in 4 languages.
Maps of the estate marked with crop rotations planned 5 years in advance. This was the hidden engine room of the Baron's medieval fantasy. "We need to speak plainly," the restorer said, closing the door behind him. Mays set down his pen, a gesture of resignation more than invitation. "I wondered when this conversation would come." The restorer placed a folder on the desk, his complete documentation of the tapestry's mechanism. Drawings, chemical analyses, historical timeline. Mays flipped through it slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching admiration. "This is exceptional work," he said finally. "You could publish this, make your reputation." "I could. The question is whether I should." Mays walked to his window, gazing out at the rain-soaked fields where green shoots were already responding to the moisture. 20 years ago, when I first came here, I was like you, obsessed with truth, with exposing superstition. I had plans to modernize everything, drag this estate into the 19th century. He turned back, and the restorer saw exhaustion in his features that went beyond physical tiredness. Then I watched the harvest of 1854 fail. Not here. We were protected by the prophecy, but on the surrounding estates. I saw families destroyed, children starving, good people reduced to beggary. All because they couldn't predict what we could foresee with simple instruments. "So you decided to continue the deception." "I decided to use every tool available to protect the people under this estate's care." Myers returned to his desk, pulling out another ledger. "Look at these figures. Mortality rates, education levels, average income. All significantly better here than anywhere else in the region." "Is that not worth a lie about some threads in an old tapestry?" The restorer thought of his own craft, the countless small deceptions inherent in restoration, filling gaps with new thread that mimicked old, recreating faded colors from imagination, imposing modern ideas of completeness on fragmentary survivals. The previous restorer, Delacroix, did he ever return? Once, 10 years later. He wanted to see what his work had wrought. Myers smiled grimly. He spent a day examining the tapestry, then told me something I've never forgotten. He said the sinew threads weren't his only addition. The original tapestry, the true 16th century work, had been damaged beyond repair in places. He'd rewoven entire sections, created beauty where only fragments remained. The whole thing is half authentic, half imagination. This revelation shifted everything. The restorer felt the vertigo of discovering that what he'd taken for solid ground was actually theatrical flooring. Then the entire restoration is a creative act, just as my weather predictions are creative acts, transforming scientific observation into mystical prophecy. Mays leaned forward. We're both in the business of making the past speak to the present, aren't we? The only difference is that my forgeries affect grain prices. That afternoon, Marie found the restorer staring at the tapestry, unmoving. She'd brought tea, but he hadn't touched it. "You look like someone attempting to solve an equation with too many variables," she observed. He told her about Delacroix's deeper deception, the tapestry's fundamental inauthenticity. Her reaction surprised him. She laughed, though not unkindly. Of course, it's not entirely original. Nothing is. Every generation adds its layer of interpretation. She traced a finger along a section of background foliage. Look at this. The plant species. Half of them are New World flora that no 16th century weaver could have known.
Some restorer, perhaps in the 1700s, added them while repairing moth damage. The restorer examined the area she indicated. She was right. Tobacco plants and maize wound through traditional European roses and lilies. How had he missed this? We see what we expect to see, Marie continued. The Baron sees prophecy. Hendrik sees opportunity. You see technical challenge. But Anna sees hope. Her father sees providence. Willem Janssens sees conspiracy. The tapestry reflects whoever looks at it. Father Antonius arrived for what had become his regular afternoon visit, bringing church records the restorer had requested. "I thought you might find this interesting," he said, producing a document from 1598. "The original commission for the tapestry." The Latin was archaic but readable. Joris van Hecht had indeed commissioned the work after losing his sons, but not as a memorial. It was meant as a marriage gift for his daughter, celebrating the continuation of the family line despite tragedy. The sorrowful face that had become the center of prophecy was originally just one figure among many in a scene of renewal. "Time changes meaning," the priest said softly. "What began as hope became sorrow. What was woven as decoration became oracle. Who are we to say which interpretation is true?" The restorer made his decision then, in the presence of these three who had become his unlikely confessors. He would complete the restoration, including careful maintenance of the sinew threads, but he would also make one small addition of his own. A single thread of modern silk, dyed to match perfectly, that would limit the range of the sinew's response. The face would still change with humidity, but less dramatically. Future predictions would require more genuine meteorological knowledge, less reliance on mechanical trickery. The last week of July arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made the recent drought seem like a distant nightmare. The restoration was complete, the tapestry ready to return to its place of honor. Yet the restorer found himself reluctant to declare the work finished, as if completing this task would require him to make peace with all he'd learned. The Baron had announced a celebration for the tapestry's rehanging, a feast for the tenants, acknowledgement of another successful prophecy, gratitude for the rain that had saved the harvest. The entire estate buzzed with preparation. In the kitchen, Anna directed younger servants in preparing traditional dishes. The restorer watched her confidence, so different from the frightened girl who'd worried about her father's debts just weeks ago. Marie found him making final notes in the chapel, his documentation now filling 3 notebooks. "I've had a letter from Paris," she said, producing an envelope with the Sorbonne's seal. "They've accepted me as an auditor for the autumn term. Professor Berthelot himself will oversee my studies in chemical analysis." The restorer felt an unexpected pang of loss. "Your uncle knows?" "I told him this morning. He raged, then sulked, then offered to pay my expenses if I promised to return for Christmas." She smiled. "I think he's secretly proud. A Van Hecht at the Sorbonne, even as a mere auditor, reflects well on the family name." She sat beside him on the chapel bench, their shoulders not quite touching. "I've been thinking about what you've taught me, not just about restoration, but about seeing.
how every thread tells multiple stories, depending on who's listening. And what story do you hear? One about transformation. Joris van Hecht transformed his grief into art. Delacroix transformed art into mechanism. Hendrik transforms mechanism into prophecy. You've transformed all of it into understanding. She paused.
What will you transform it into now? Before he could answer, Father Antonius entered with Willem Janssens. The grain merchant looked uncomfortable in the sacred space, his usual bluster subdued. The good father insisted I come, he muttered. Mynheer Janssens has something to tell you, the priest said gently. The merchant struggled for words, then spoke in a rush. My boy recovered! The medicine the estate sent, I know it came from Mies, though he claimed it was the Baron's charity. The fever broke 3 days ago. He paused, wrestling with pride. I've been wrong about many things. After Janssens departed, Father Antonius remained. He'll never fully trust the prophecies, but he's agreed to stop openly opposing them. Sometimes that's the best peace we can achieve. Not agreement, but cessation of hostilities. That evening, Hendrik Mies came to inspect the completed restoration. He examined the tapestry with the eye of someone who understood its true nature, noting the subtle changes the restorer had made. You've limited the range of motion, he observed quietly. Slightly. The mechanism still functions, but requires more precise atmospheric conditions to show dramatic change. Mies nodded slowly, making the prophecies harder to read, requiring more actual knowledge to interpret. A slight smile crossed his features. Perhaps that's wise. I won't always be here to manage the predictions. My successor should have to work for their foresight. You're leaving? Eventually. The Baron's nephew will inherit, a young man with modern ideas about scientific agriculture. He'll have less patience for mystical tapestries. Mies touched the textile gently, almost affectionately. But by then, perhaps the transition can be managed, from prophecy to science, without destroying the faith that sustains people. The next morning brought the rehanging. The entire household gathered as workers carefully raised the tapestry back to its ancestral position. The restorer watched the Baron's face as Joris van Hecht was revealed in his renewed splendor. Tears actually gathered in the old man's eyes. Magnificent, he breathed. You've brought our ancestor back to life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth. Marie caught the restorer's eye and smiled, sadly. Father Antonius murmured a blessing that sounded more like an apology. Hendrik Mies stood apart, already calculating how to manage future predictions with the tapestry's modified responsiveness. Anna approached the restorer during the feast that followed. My father wants to thank you personally, she said. He knows you spoke for us about the loan. I merely mentioned the situation to Miss Marie. You did more than that. You saw us as people, not just tenants. She hesitated, then added, My brother writes from Ghent that his master seeks someone skilled in restoration. Churches there have old tapestries needing care. I thought you should know, if you ever wanted work away from Brussels. The celebration continued into evening. Music, dancing, the release of tension that had built through drought and uncertainty. The restorer stood apart, watching the community knit itself back together through shared relief. The Baron told stories of other prophecies, other harvests saved by ancestral wisdom. No one questioned the narrative. As night fell, the restorer made one last visit to the great hall. The tapestry hung in shadow, lit only by moonlight through tall windows.
Joris van Hecht's face seemed peaceful now, the sinew threads relaxed in the humid evening air. Or perhaps that was just imagination. The human need to see meaning in mechanical processes. Tomorrow he would return to Brussels, to his quiet workshop and predictable restorations. He would carry with him the weight of secrets about thread and sinew, about truth and community, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of an uncertain world. His documentation would remain private, filed away with other puzzles he'd solved but chosen not to reveal. October in Brussels carried the smell of coal smoke and coming winter. The restorer sat in his workshop, sorting through the Morning Post with fingers stained from working on a fragment of medieval orphrey. 3 months had passed since his return from the Van Hecht estate, 3 months of familiar work and unfamiliar contemplation. The letter from Marie arrived on thick paper that rustled with importance. Her handwriting had gained confidence, like her thoughts. "Dear friend," she began, "Paris exceeds all expectations. Professor Berthelot has permitted me to attend his lectures on organic chemistry, provided I sit behind the prescribed screen." The irony isn't lost on me. Hiding truth behind fabric, just as we did with the tapestry. She wrote of her studies, the precise measurement of gases, the behavior of compounds under pressure. Everything I learn about atmospheric science confirms what we discovered. The sinew threads were brilliant engineering, whoever first conceived them. I've begun a paper on hygroscopic materials in historical textiles, carefully theoretical, of course. A second letter bore the Van Hecht seal. Hendrik Mays wrote in his careful hand that the harvest had been exceptional, the estate prospering. The ancestors' prophecies have become more difficult to read since your restoration. I take this as a challenge to improve my meteorological instruments. The Baron, fortunately, interprets it as a test of faith, requiring more careful observation. Both interpretations serve. The restorer set down the letters and returned to his work. The orphrey fragment belonged to the Cathedral of St. Michael and St. Gudula, gold thread on silk depicting an angel's wing. Age had made the gold brittle, threatening to crack with each handling. He worked with infinite patience, stabilizing each thread before moving to the next. This was restoration as he'd always understood it, preserving beauty without deception, maintaining truth without elaboration. Yet even here, choices emerged. The original embroiderer had made an error in the angel's feathers, breaking the pattern's symmetry. Should he correct it? Preserve the mistake? His master would have said to maintain absolute fidelity to the original. But which original? The maker's intention or their execution? Madame Verstraeten knocked, entering with coffee and news. "That young man from Ghent was here again," she said, setting down the cup with meaningful emphasis. "The one seeking a restoration master for the church commission." The restorer nodded absently. 3 times now the messenger had come, each time increasing the offered fee. The churches of Ghent held treasures dating back to the Van Eycks. Tapestries, vestments, altar cloths, deteriorating in damp bell towers and forgotten sacristies. Work enough for years, if he wanted it. "Your wife would have said to take it," Madame Verstraeten ventured. "She always said Brussels was too small for your talents." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps distance from the capital would provide perspective on what he'd learned at the Van Hecht estate. In Ghent, he could practice his craft without the weight of metropolitan scrutiny, could choose which truths to reveal and which to preserve in silence. That afternoon, Father Antonius's letter arrived. The old priest wrote sparingly, but with purpose. Willem Janssens has become our most successful grain merchant, though he still grumbles about mystical nonsense. Anna married well, a clerk in the provincial government who appreciates her intelligence. Her father retains his tenancy, the debts cleared by an exceptional harvest. The priest's postscript carried deeper weight. I've been thinking about our conversations regarding truth and mercy. Scripture tells us the truth shall set us free, but it doesn't specify free from what. Sometimes we're freed from illusion, only to be enslaved by disappointment. The tapestry continues to bring comfort to those who need to believe in something greater than atmospheric pressure. Is that not its own form of truth? As evening approached, the restorer made his decision. He would accept the Ghent commission, but on his terms. He would document everything, every restoration, every discovery, every choice between truth and beauty, not for publication, but for some future moment when the world might be ready to understand that authenticity itself was a construction, that every preserved artifact was part original, part interpretation, part hope. He pulled out his notebook from the Van Hecht restoration, reading through his technical observations. On the final page, he'd sketched Joris Van Hecht's face as it appeared after his work, neither sorrowful nor joyful, but watchful, waiting. Below it, he now wrote, "Every thread carries multiple truths. The silk remembers the worm. The gold recalls the mine. The wool holds the sheep's winter warmth." We restorers pretend to recover original meaning, but we're only adding another layer to the palimpsest. The Van Hecht tapestry taught me this: sometimes the lie woven into fabric becomes more truthful than the facts it conceals. We preserve not just thread and image, but the entire web of belief, deception, and necessity that gives textiles their power over human hearts. The workshop had grown dark around him, only his single lamp illuminating the angel's wing he'd been repairing. Tomorrow he would write to Ghent, accepting their commission. He would pack his inherited needles, his graduated magnifying glasses, his samples of thread organized by provenance and date. He would carry with him the knowledge gained from sinew and prophecy, from Marie's chemistry and Hendrik's pragmatism, from Father Antonius's wisdom and Anna's gratitude. But tonight, he simply sat in the familiar peace of his workshop, surrounded by fragments of beauty awaiting resurrection. Through the grimy window, Brussels's gas lamps began their nightly illumination, each one a small victory over darkness. The angel's wing caught their light, gold thread shimmering like a promise that some things, at least, could be saved whole and perfect and true.